Chapter 10 begins our exploration into change and political development, and what we're going to look at are some of the various factors, different attributes for political change and political development. Now, assessing countries by their development is a bit of a challenge for a political scientist because all political scientists have different criteria, different taxonomies, different standards in how to assess countries of the world. And in this presentation, we'll be looking at a few of those. Now, one very obvious and very common way to measure countries by development would be to look at their gross domestic product, the total value of the goods and services produced within that country in a given year. And you can see in this illustration taken from a Wikipedia page that the United States, China, and certain Western European countries, Britain, France, and Germany, pretty much lead the pack. And all of those countries would fit the definition of developed countries by standards of GDP, or gross domestic product. Not to be outdone, you also have Japan, Brazil, and also the smaller countries in South Europe. You have Italy, in addition to, I think I mentioned Australia already. So those would be some of your developed countries. And, not that far behind, you have Russia, India, as well as Saudi Arabia and Spain. Of course, not everyone agrees on measuring development by GDP alone. There are so many different variables: a country's size, a country's economy, a country's history, as well as a country's population. In fact, that's a good segue into this next one. You could look at gross domestic product per capita, that is to say, the measure of a country's economic output, but one that is accounting for the population of the country, right? The United States of America, for example, has a very high GDP, but not the highest population in the world. And when you factor in population, you see slightly different results. So in this case, the darker reddish countries are the ones at the top of the list. And then what you have is Norway, the tiny Gulf state of Qatar, as well as some of the smaller European countries, sandwiched between the larger GDP European countries in the previous slide. And not to be outdone, there's also Hong Kong. You can see that small little speck on an otherwise sea of red just in China's southeast. That's Hong Kong, which is measured on its own, has a high GDP per capita. If you take a look at some of the more populated countries like India, you do see an interesting contrast between just measuring the GDP and measuring the GDP per capita. India falls lower on the list at that point. But maybe there are more specific factors you might look at when measuring and assessing a company's development. Why not look at employment and unemployment? You would see something very interesting. If we look at countries by unemployment, this is a chart pulled from countryeconomy.com, a great site for resources. We have countries that we would otherwise consider developed by gross domestic product that top the list for unemployment. You have Spain and Greece, their numbers 3 and 2 respectively. South Africa, which for the continent of Africa is one of the more developed countries, but tops the list for unemployment. Let's take a quick look. We have the Eurozone. Those are countries a little further down the list, countries that use the euro as a standard of currency. Interestingly enough, the Eurozone is there. Not at the top of the list, but not far from it. On the other hand, when we look at countries that have a very low unemployment rate, you might see some surprises here. Not so much Japan, because Japan also does have a high GDP, but I mean, if you take a look, Mexico is higher up on the list for low unemployment. On the other hand, when it comes to GDP, Mexico is probably going to be much lower on the list. The United States, The United States is just left out of the top 10 when it comes to countries ranked by low unemployment. And while the United States is doing just better than the United Kingdom, it is not doing as well as Mexico. And so on this standard of development, you might rank countries substantially differently. You could also look at political development. So as we take a step away from economic factors, you might just look at how the governments are set up. What means of democracy and public participation are there for a country? Again, the darker blue countries would top the list, and we see once again our Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland. We also see Iceland and Canada, sort of in the darker shades of blue, Australia, New Zealand. We see the United States in a slightly lighter shade of blue, but still towards the top. Why would that be? A country that has a high GDP ranks lower on the scale of democratization? Well, you might consider that the United States is a representative democracy. The United States is a republic. We have one branch of government, the Supreme Court, in which the people have no popular input in the selection process of Supreme Court and federal judges, and a president of the United States that is elected indirectly. So our democracy is much less direct than some of the democracies in other parts of the world. And if you look right in the middle of the European continent, you'll find Switzerland, which actually still has some aspects of direct democracy to this day. Even India, the world's largest democracy, and Brazil, another large population democracy, do not rank at the top when it comes to how democratization is measured. So if you'd like to look more at this, you would see, you can visit the website for the Economist Intelligence Unit. These rankings are already 1 year old, so they may have shifted a little bit. Related to democratization, we can look at countries and assess their development by the degree of civil liberties and personal freedoms that the population of those countries enjoys. We're talking here about the right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the right to criticize your government, a free media, certain unalienable rights like the ones affirmed in the American Declaration of Independence. And here, again, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and a good chunk of Eastern Europe ranks very high, but the Scandinavian countries, once again, are ranked highest by the, in this case, the Cato Institute. And while most of the darker shaded countries are democratic republics, it might be interesting to note the varying degree of civil liberties and freedom in some authoritarian countries as well. Just because a government is authoritarian doesn't necessarily mean that individuals won't have civil liberties or freedoms. Although that does tend to be the case more often than not. Related to civil liberties and personal freedoms, you might look at religious restrictions and religious tolerance as a measure for political development of a country. How interesting it may be to see, again, India, the world's largest democracy, ranked much lower on this measure of political development. But then, as you look just a little further west to some of the countries that may not be as developed when it comes to GDP in South America and Africa, you see higher degrees of religious tolerance, lower degrees of religious restrictions. So, again, a different way of measuring development and a different result. Other factors in which you would measure a developed country might be gender equality. The United Nations Development Program released this information just a few years ago on countries and their rankings in terms of gender equality. And there may be a few surprises here. If you look at Libya and Saudi Arabia, they rank higher, again, than some other countries, which are democratic republics like Brazil and India. China, not exactly the largest democracy in the world, not exactly a democratic republic, ranking higher than, again, India and Brazil, countries that are, by their documents, democratic republics. Some factor in public health and more specific areas like longevity as a way to measure how developed a country is. Would longevity be a factor in how you measure the development of a country, particularly when examining the public health of a country? It's a good question to consider. And so is access to technology. Here you have a very specific sub-factor in technology, that's internet speed. And you have countries like South Korea, Norway, Sweden, again the Scandinavians and Finland not far behind, doing very well, but not to be outdone by countries in East Asia like Singapore, Japan, and again South Korea. The US in the top 10. In this growing age of globalization and interconnectivity, perhaps access to the internet and internet speed might be a way in which you measure countries and their development. And so now it's left to you, and this will be the class discussion for this particular module. How would you rank countries, and what factors would you use for assessing their development? What would be your taxonomy? You now are the political scientist or the political economist. What would be your top 3? Share it with the class and defend your ideas. It should be interesting to see the results.